So we're starting out here with just a little bit of color. Now we get all of our color in two different forms. One is going to be frit and the other is going to be bar. I'll give you an example of both. And let's see if I don't have the exact color that she's using, but so this is almost the same color, red and red. We've got the frit, it's just little particles. We've got the solid bar, it's solid chunk. This is solid colored glass. We use metal oxides to create the various colors. They melt them in big tanks just like we have here, usually a little bit bigger, and then they scoop that glass out. They pour it into water, it breaks into little pieces through thermal shock, creating little particles, or they can take a gob and just sort of roll it out into a big kind of bar form. Now we just started with a chunk of a bar, and what she started with is a purple color. It's very close to maybe what the inside of this one's going to be. So it's a really beautiful opaque purple. And that opaque purple is just heated up and formed into a big blob, and then we drop it over the surface of our clear bubble, and Jeff will squeeze this up and around the entire inside of the bubble. Everybody's got their little movements, their facial expressions. That's always a good thing to watch when you're watching glass blowing, all the facial expressions, whether we're working with the pipe or my favorite is to watch people at the bench, especially if they're using a tool like shears and they're like chomping along as they cut the piece. But everybody's got a little bit of something when they're sitting and working with glass. But we've got this color, and this is what we call, again, an overlay. We're just creating a thin layer of this purple glass around the bubble, and then we'll add lots of clear glass and then lots of other colors on top of it. So this is really just creating the foundation color for our piece, that purple color. Since we're using the solid bar, we're going to get smooth, even, beautiful color. Like our rocket here. You can see it's very even. It's two different colors, but there's gray and there's red, and it's nice and smooth. If we were using the frit color, you'd get something that look a little bit more like this. It's all made of little polka dots because it's all these little pieces of glass melting into the surface. You can make a lot of different designs using either one, whether they're wrapped, whether they're layered, whether they're stacked on top of each other. You can get lots of fun effects, but that's the general rule. Anytime you're using the solid color, you're going to get a smooth and even coat, and anytime you're using the frit, you're going to get mottled color on the surface. So the key to success, making a good overlay: 1, have a nice hot blob of glass. 2, have a slightly colder bubble on the inside. If we're trying to squish that glass evenly over top of our clear bubble, it's a lot easier if you can do hot squishy over more solid than squishy over squishy. You can imagine how difficult that would be. So part of this is the balance of temperature between those two materials, or between those two types of glass. Now, Jeff's going to make this look really easy. He's doing a lot of very smooth movements and everything, but there's actually a lot of finesse involved in the marvering process and this laying over of the color. If you push too hard or you don't push evenly all the way around, you can end up pushing that color into uneven areas, and then you'll have a very uneven pattern of your glass. Now, unfortunately, when we went to heat this color up, this glass color was heated up in the box over here, because glass, when it heats and cools, it expands and contracts. And so if it heats and it cools too quickly, it will end up cracking. So we needed to take that big chunk of purple glass, and we put it into the oven over here, and we warmed it up slowly so that it could be picked up on the end of the iron and heated up. But I guess we didn't go slow enough, because when we picked up that color and we went to introduce it to the hotter reheating chamber, it cracked in a few places. Now those cracks, as they form, if you've got that rod and it's got cracks everywhere, as they start to heat, the outer edges of those cracks are going to round up and sort of bead together and trap air on the inside sometimes. So there's a couple little air bubbles. He was just digging those little air bubbles out of that overlay. Because those air bubbles, most of the time, it's not going to be a big deal. but you could come to the surface and pop eventually, leaving a little window in our color. And we want to have a nice foundation of our color. So Jeff's going to take a little bit of time to make sure that the color is just right on this laying process. It's very nice. She's given her approval. So Laura Donefer is here, and this is her design, this is her piece. She's going to have a lot of people helping her today, but she's the boss. We got to listen to what she says, and she gives us the okay or the nay on everything that we do. So she'll be orchestrating the rest of this process as we go along, and probably jumping in once in a while to help out. But if you're not familiar with Laura, we've got a lot of really beautiful pieces. If you've got your phone, you could look her up real quick. Laura Donefer, see some images. We've got some really wonderful pieces. We're going to be making one of her baskets, I believe. Is that what it's? So, Jeff, is that what we're making tonight? Is the basket? Confirm that in a moment. But we're going to start layering up our clear glass. That little bit of color in the clear that we had would not make a very big piece. And we're making something much bigger today. So he goes in for what we call a gather of glass. You can see that beautiful orange glow. Very, very hot. It's 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 1150 Celsius inside of that furnace. And so the glass inside is about the consistency of honey. He can just wind it on the end of the pipe and get it to stick to that first layer of glass. I imagine we're going to be layering this up a few times because we can't pull out a huge amount of glass all at once. If you've ever tried to get honey on the end of a straw or the end of your spoon, you know, you want to get greedy and like get a lot on the end. It's really hard to keep it on there. It just wants to drip back into the furnace. So we'll go a couple times into that furnace, letting the inside layers cool down slightly so that they're nice and stable for that outside layer. I'll show you exactly how hot this is by taking a little gather here to demonstrate. This is all clear glass in our furnace again. So nice and hot, stop turning, drip it right to the Marver. Woo! Look at this beautiful artwork I've made. So we've got nice hot glass. It's still moving right there on the pipe, but this is pretty much rigid. I could even touch it. It's cooled off enough right there at the end. So it doesn't take long for that material to cool, so we have to work quickly with that. But you can already see very clear, still very orange. So we're looking at some of those colors, not as in red, blue, orange, yellow, green, blue, but more as in the heat. The color of the heat helps us dictate where that glass is hot, where it's not, that nice orange glow. Lots of different things. So now it cooled it down. Looks like Jeff's family has arrived. Hello, hello, welcome. Fantastic. So we're going right back in. We've got, again, a big ceramic crucible. That bottom half of that furnace is basically a big ceramic bowl full of all the clear molten glass. This particular furnace holds around 1,000 pounds. It's a lot of glass to play with. And Jeff's done a beautiful job getting a very nice gather on top of that layer. Now, the pipes can get a little bit warm. And, of course, the lower the furnace, the further down you have to go in to find the layer of glass. And so anytime that pipe gets a little too warm, we can use our pipe cooler here to just cool that off. The pipes themselves are made of stainless steel. That means that it's a metal that's going to dissipate the heat quite easily. So you don't have to worry about it getting as hot as maybe like a copper pipe. I can't even imagine trying to blow glass on a copper pipe. That thing would be hot all the way back to the mouthpiece. But stainless steel dissipates its heat a little bit, and it's a little easier to hold. We have a lot of people really concerned about where we're holding this pipe, and we too are concerned on where we hold that pipe. But we train ourselves to hold it down on the shiny end, not on the dark end where the glass might be. Because yes, the pipe can get hot enough to end up burning you very severely if you're not careful about where you grab it. But if you're grabbing hold of pipes, a lot of people also wonder, well, why don't you wear gloves? If it's that dangerous, if that metal is so hot, why can't you wear gloves? Have you noticed how much turning Jeff has had to do here. So he's got to keep that pipe turning at all times. And if he stops turning, you saw what happened with that glass drip, right? It's going to just drip to the floor. So if he's turning, he wants to make sure he's got the best dexterity available, and that's without gloves. Gloves are going to end up making it a little bit difficult to turn that pipe and really feel what's happening with that pipe. Now he is putting on another piece of protective equipment. That is a Kevlar sleeve. Now that glass, as it's coming out of the furnace, 2,000 degrees, you can imagine the radiant heat that comes off of that material. And so wearing Kevlar sleeves, wearing cotton clothing, all of these sorts of things help from that radiant heat from burning all his arm hair off. Most glass workers don't have a lot of arm hair on their right hand from putting all their hands so close to the heat. So we've gotten a couple gathers. I don't know if we're going to go in for another one before we start adding more colors. I think maybe we are. Starting a little bit of inflation. And he's using a very ugly tool, but one of my favorite tools right now. And that's folded wet newspaper. So you can fold up a newspaper and burn the surface and then put a little water on it. And you can introduce it to that glass as a flexible tool. So it's almost like touching the glass, which we learn not to do, because that's not a good idea. But if you do want that dexterity, if you want to be able to feel how the glass is moving around, using that wet newspaper is a really wonderful tool to allow that to happen. So anytime we touch it, it cools it, and so we only want to touch that glass where we're trying to shape it, where we're trying to cool it. Looks like we're going in for yet another gather. Strong Jeff. Jeff will take a few gathers and then hand it off to George here eventually. They're going to share the heavy lifting tonight. Yeah. So those of you who are just joining us, didn't catch this at the beginning, we've got the one and only Laura Donefer with us here today. She's been teaching. Yeah, you can give her a big round of applause. She's been teaching over at the studio, and we've invited her to come over here tonight to make a fantastic piece for you folks. And so she's brought her entire class to assist. We've got Jeff Mack here. He's been gathering up and doing the first stages of this object. George Kennard's going to be helping out as well. My name's Helen. I'll be narrating for this first half, and then I think we're going to pass it off to Lucas a little bit later for more narration. We're going to be here for a couple hours working on this beautiful piece here with Laura. Now you can see as the scale builds up, it gets a little too difficult to hold that wooden block up to the glass, so we're going to bring the glass to the block. And these wooden blocks are wonderful tools. These are shaping tools. They're made of fruit wood, like cherry, apple, usually cherry. But they're fruit wood, they're nice tight grains, they burn very evenly, but we can't let them burn as much as we need to create a steam layer. If we just let it burn, it would start to stick to the glass. Glass is very sticky to most materials, especially dry wood. So those blocks are soaked in water so that the steam layer keeps it from sticking. It rides over the surface, and we get a beautiful round shape when we use that block. So you're going to see that block being used quite often only at the very beginning of that process. As soon as you gather out of the furnace, you got liquid hot glass, you're going to use that block just to help shape up that first little layer. Trying to balance out those temperatures, allowing the outside to cool, the inside to heat up. Because remember, we allowed that inner core to get a little colder. If we go into our furnace and it's too hot, we can lose everything. Has anyone here ever made candles before or seen candle making? You got a nice wax pot, and you take your wick and you dip it in there, and you get this beautiful little layer of wax. But if you get too excited and you go in too quickly and go to try for a second one, what does it do? It just melts that first one. Everything goes back into the pot. But if you let it solidify, you let it harden, you let it cool down a little bit, you go back into that wax very quickly, you get a second layer. So the same kind of thing happens with the glass. If you go in too hot with a molten layer, you could lose all the layers. But if you let it cool and solidify, you're able to get that next level. Now we've kind of just standing around, so I'm thinking we're gathering again. We're going to gather one more time, maybe twice. I know Laura said earlier, it doesn't necessarily need to be huge, but it needs to be thick. So we're going to have lots of glass added to that piece. Now, one of the things about gathering is we've got a bowl full of glass. The bottom half of that furnace is that big ceramic crucible. And we can only gather as deep as we have glass to cover all of it. So it has to be deep enough for us to go and completely immerse that blob into the glass. If you try to gather into a furnace that's too low, you'll end up just creating like a V-neck sweater or something right over the top. I'm sorry? What is he peddling? He is making water squirt out of the top of that machine. So this is just a pipe cooler. So we've got so many high-tech things here, but we went fairly low-tech on our pipe cooler. So he's just creating the little pump action, and that helps bring some of that water up to cool that pipe. Especially dealing with very heavy glass like this, you really want to think about your ergonomics. You want to hold as close to the glass as you can to keep that balance. The further away the glass is from your body, the heavier it is going to feel. So it's already a lot of pounds. We don't want to make it feel even heavier. So by cooling that pipe, he can choke up on that pipe, go a little bit closer to the glass itself, and make the whole process just a little bit more ergonomic. So on a piece like this kind of scale, you're going to see a lot of teamwork happening. And this is a really important aspect of glassworking. And honestly, one of the reasons I really loved the Hot Shop the first time I walked into it, because you've got lots of people working together on one piece. Especially, again, that size and the heaviness of this piece makes it a lot easier if you can get someone to help kind of trade off with. Maybe they'll do a reheat. They're going to help turn while you're doing things. Somebody blowing onto the end of that pipe, allowing the glass to expand where you are down watching it, so you can make sure it's blowing out at the right place. And eventually you'll start to see people shielding each other from all that radiant heat, all that 2,000-degree material coming out at you. It's a quick thing to distract your brain if you feel like you're going to catch on fire. So if you can have people shielding each other, it lets the gaffer concentrate just a little bit more on that process. All right, so I was just told we are finally live on the internet here, so we'd like to welcome everyone from around the world who's watching us here tonight at the Corning Museum of Glass. We are here with Laura Donefer, fantastic and wonderful. So I have not seen her for a bit, so it's really exciting to get her back here in the studio. She is teaching over in the studio of the Corning Museum of Glass here this week. There she is. So she's going to be the gaffer, the main artist here tonight, working with Jeff Mack and George Kennard. They're going to be helping her make her dreams come true on the end of a pipe here tonight with all sorts of wonderful colors. If you're not familiar with Laura Donefer's work, I highly suggest you check her out online. She has a wonderful sense of color, lots of beautiful vibrancy to everything that she does. And she really puts a lot of energy into everything that she does as well. So this should be a really wonderful couple of hours here with Laura and the team. And I believe we're going to start adding all of our colors. So to start out, we just started with a little bit of purple glass overlaid onto some clear. We built up lots of clear glass, and now we get to start painting with color. And that's really what she's thinking of. This is a painting of color. We've got lots of bar color that we've pre-warmed in the oven over here. And so bar color is just the solid chunks of glass. They can make and melt an entire tank of colored glass and then pull it out and make these rods. We've got lots of these chunks in the oven available, warming up. So we got lots of different colors that we're going to be using to decorate this bubble and start building up the form that we want. And I'm just going to stand here and keep it turning and keep it ready for Jeff. Do you want? All right, going back in for another gather. I've lost count. How many gathers was that? Has anybody been counting? 5? I'll take 5. That sounds about right. 5 layers of glass. So it is the act of gathering, going into the furnace, winding glass around the end of that pipe, but it also refers to the amount of glass. Now he's doing what we call a strip gather, which is taking that glass and draining some of the excess off the external into the bucket there on the floor. And by doing that, it gets just a finite amount, gives him exactly the amount of glass that he wants, and also allows it to shape itself a little bit before, without having to go into a block. So once again, going right back to that cold. So we're going to start calling in the students, it sounds like. We've got Steve coming in. I heard that name. But we've got lots of different colors, lots of bar colors. We've got Aaron here working with, I think, a red. I think from what I remember, it was reds and purples mostly for this piece. Probably a couple other pops of color. Over here on the color booth, we've got powdered glass. It's all the same material, it just comes to us in different forms. We can have the bar color, we can have frit, which is the little particles, all the way down to a powder onto the surface. So they're using just a little sieve to sieve powder onto the surface of that hot gather, and it will start to stick. And it'll start to melt in, and then it'll become that surface layer. Now, every different kind of color that we use is going to give a slightly different effect. So if we're using bar color, nice and smooth and even, like our rocket here, we've got a nice, smooth, even color. If we use the frit, we're going to get polka dots and this polka dot effect. But you can see they're pretty big polka dots. And even our elephant here, it looks like it's all gray, but if you look really closely, it's made of all sorts of little polka dots. So powder does some really beautiful things because it's so thin, it's so little, all those particles, it gets really soft. It almost gives you this velvety finish. Now that's all going to heat in, it's all going to smooth out, but visually it's going to give you this really nice painterly, velvety surface. We've got a question on the internet here. It says, how heavy is that glass? What do you think, guys? How heavy are we looking over here with this? You did about 5 gathers. How much weight do you think we've got there? 20 pounds? Yeah, about 20 pounds. But when you put it on the end of a 4-foot pole, it feels a lot heavier than 20 pounds. So this is where that ergonomics comes in. You're going to see them holding the glass as close to the pipe as they can or close to the glass as they can to try to keep it a little bit lighter. So the powder is very thin, and only so much will stick to the surface of that hot bubble. So we'll go back a few times. Every time it's coated on the outside, it's pretty much not sticky anymore. So we go back into the reheating chamber to melt all of that color in, and then we can go back for another layer. So you can start to see these bar colors being formed up on the end of the pipes here. And when they come to us, they're basically like this. Usually they're a little bit longer. But you need to get them kind of squished together and put into just the right shape to do the painting that she wants to do. So they've picked them up on the end of solid irons with a little bit of clear glass. Hot things stick to hot things, so you need a little bit of clear glass on the end of the pipe to get this to stick. And then once you've got that hot, you'll see they're squishing it back and creating a little bit more of a squat, tapered shape. In order to make this into a stringer or a lasso or a wrap, I think that's what we're mostly doing is wrapping these colors around. You need to have the right setup, because if you just bring that blob over and it's too hot in the wrong places, it'll just blob onto it all at once. And so it's a little bit of pressure on these guys, actually, to make sure that they set this up perfectly and make sure that when it's delivered to Laura, she gets the shape that she wants. So here we go. George is turning, Jeff is shielding, Laura is doing the shaping with that folded wet newspaper. Really gives a easy shaping on the outside. We're trying to keep this, I think, fairly round at this point until we get all of our colors and things added to it. All right, so I just got a confirmation. We do have a little bit of a sketch on the back of our board to show you what this final piece will look like, part of the basket series. Now, the only thing about this picture is it's black and it's on a whiteboard. It doesn't have nearly the number of colors that we're going to be using for this particular piece. So this is really just a general outline of what this piece is going to make, but you're going to be surprised all the beautiful additions that will be added to the surface. Now we've got the melting furnace. We also have a reheating chamber here, and that's going to be where we can work and remelt the glass. You can see this one over here is going to be quite the hub of activity. They are sharing that heat source just to try to speed up the delivery of all these bits. But these furnaces that we have here, these run at the same temperature as our melting furnaces, that 2,100 degree range, or about 1150 Celsius. And the reason that they have to be that hot is because sometimes we need to remelt this glass just as hot as it was out of the furnace. So this is going to be the exact application. I love this sort of fluidity of the material as it pulls across, dabbing and stretching and painting with this solid glass. All right, there's our first layer of glass. It looks like more purple glass. Purple, purple, purple. It's going to be fantastic. But I was wondering, up there in the booth, do we have our music? We really need a little bit of music, I think, for Laura's piece. Get the energy going up here. Laura brought 2 discs with her to play music. All right, I was informed we cannot play as much music as what we thought we could due to copyright laws. So we'll get the enthusiasm from the audience. How about that? Yeah, all right. Fantastic. That's one of the things you do see in a lot of studios is a lot of music, a lot of energy. Anytime I have seen Laura work anywhere around the world, she always brings a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm to the experience. All right, now we do have a venue online. If anyone's got any questions, they're writing them in. But does anyone here in the audience have any questions for us? Stunned silence already. All right, well, let us know if you think of anything. We can help to make this experience even better for you. Looks like we've got our second layer, maybe a red color on there. And we're going to keep building these up. Now the texture that you see, a lot of this whipping of glass, the faster she moves, the hotter the glass, the thinner the line, whipping it into shape. It really gets a lot of gestural qualities to this. Very nicely done. Very nicely done. purples, orange, reds, a bit of celadon, tangerine. Oh man, this is going to be beautiful. 3 kinds of purple. Yeah, absolutely. So this particular piece has so many colors, all those blue, purples, 4 different kind of purples, lots of different colors. And this vessel shape is really only the beginning of this beautiful piece in its final stages. So we're going to be adding lots of color. We're going to be making this beautiful basket form. But again, you need to check out Laura's online presence and see some of these images of the baskets and the things that she does. Because beyond the hot shop, a lot of artists will make components here in the hot shop, and then she goes back to Canada. She's from Canada, and she's got this beautiful property and a workshop with bin after bin after bin of all kinds of little beads and objects and things, and she makes the torchwork additions as well. And then she'll spend months and months just hand applying all of these little things, tying knots and adding all the additions to this to create this beautiful arch above this particular vessel. So kind of the handle of the basket is highly decorated with all of these wonderful splays of bits of glass and bits of found materials. And so you definitely want to check her out. This particular piece won't be, of course, finished for months and months from now, but you'll be able to see some of the examples of these beautiful pieces. One of these iconic pieces that Laura does. You can find her out online. We've got her name over here, Laura Donefer. You can write it down, make sure and look her up. So Laura's been over at the studio teaching a class. It's only a 1-week class, so it's a pretty concentrated class, but she's brought some of her students over here today to help with this demo. We've got our regular glass blowers that are here at the museum demonstrating every single day. George Kennard being one of our master glass workers, one of our full-time staff and lead gaffers here. He's taken over the pipe, and he's going to be smoothing all of that texture down into the bubble itself. Because even though the final piece will have a lot of texture on the additions, I believe the surface of this one will be fairly smooth. Now I say fairly because if you look at the surface of all this color, it's still going to have a little bit of texture. One of the beautiful things about this material is that every color that we use in every different kind of glass, it heats and cools slightly differently. So if you've got what we consider a soft color, those are usually the very dark colors like blacks, dark blues, things that will absorb heat energy as they're being melted. Those are going to stay really soft and malleable. Then we've got what we call stiff colors. Those are usually lighter colors. It's not a set rule, but that's usually things that are reflecting heat energy, like whites, like this purple, things that will not get as soft. And so if you put those side by side, even if we were to make a vessel that had even stripes of those colors and you go to blow it out, the soft colors are going to want to move slightly differently than the stiff colors and start to manipulate around that form. So in the final surface, unless they gather over this, and I think it's going to stay with the colors on the surface, then all of those textures will slightly come through on the final vessel, even if we don't gather over it. So it's one of my favorite things, working with color, leaving a lot of that textural quality to it, and then further working it beyond that. Everybody loves glass for its shininess and its smoothness, but there's so many things that can be done with this material beyond just what can be done melting this material. So some of the processes that she's going to addition as well is taking it into a cold shop. Once you've into a cold shop, you can grind and polish the surface, maybe take off any sharpness that would be. You could create textures. We actually have a beautiful piece here, little bubble. You see all the little incised marks here on this vessel? Maybe I'll come out there and see a little bit closer. But this is part of that cold working process. You can take diamond wheels, can take silicon carbide. There's different ways to create that texture. And you can see these are just incised surfaces. Pardon? So this is in a cold state, there's a wheel, a diamond wheel, and you just introduce this to the surface of that wheel and it carves out a little space. You can see examples of that in our museum. If you go through where they have all the cut crystal, there's a great exhibit up there with the wheels. It kind of shows someone making the piece. But this is another option, that beautiful texture. I just love that on the surface. So there's lots of fun things that can be done with this material, not just in the hot shop. And most artists will work both hot and cold to make their objects. So how different glasses melt at different temperatures? All right, that's a great question. So does all glass melt at the same temperature? In general, no. It has to do with partly, again, it's the colors, the different metal oxides can affect the way that the color will melt. Some will melt a little bit easier, a little softer, but it also just has to do with the chemistry of the glass itself. So who can tell me what glass is made out of? Anyone? Silica, there you go, silica. So silica is going to make any type of glass. That's the common denominator in all types of glass is silica. But silica as a material, you might have heard of it called sand, but it's basically a refined version of sand. Silica by itself would take upwards of 4,000 degrees to get it to melt. So to start off with the basic form of glass, that would be at 4,000. Now our glass, that only takes about 2,000 degrees to get it melt. So how do we change that? How do we create a type of glass that melts easier and at lower temperatures? The basic is to add flux to it. So different kinds of fluxes. What we're using is what's called a soda lime glass. So we're adding soda ash to the glass, and that lowers the melting temperature. We can also add things like lead. Lead's going to lower the melting temperature. We can add boron. Boron's going to lower the melting temperature. Those are all fluxes, and each one of those in mixture with the silica is going to create a different kind of glass with different working properties. Now our glass, we want to play with it. We want it nice and soft and malleable, and you can see she's doing some beautiful decorating here with all of those colors and layering it up onto that bubble. It's designed to stay hot for longer periods of time. So it's been specially formulated for glass blowers, really, for us to be able to play with it and make fun things. If I were a manufacturer of bottles, this glass would be very frustrating for my manufacturing floor, because as soon as I would make my soda bottle and clasp the mold around it and blow the bubble and create this object, it would start slumping and sagging and melting on itself before it hardened as it went down the conveyor belt. So that type of glass, even though it is still a soda lime glass, just like ours, they tweak that formula a little bit to have it set up faster and be able to use it for production. Now, it's not to say that you can't make things like this out of recycled soda bottles. If we collected a bunch of them, put them into a furnace, melted them, make a big tank of glass, that is completely possible. And there's a lot of studios actually around the world that will recycle glass and use that as its main source of melted glass. But they just have to work a little quicker, a little different style of working, but you can still get some beautiful pieces out of it. So yeah, the chemistry of glass, every tweak to that formula will create different types of glasses, and the working properties, whether it's what temperature it melts at or how long it stays hot, or whether it picks up surface qualities better than others, optical qualities like the leaded glass will give you a better optical quality. Borosilicate glass is going to give you more thermal resistance. As it heats and it cools, it doesn't contract and expand as much as our glass. So all of those things will influence the melting of that glass. Hopefully that answered your question online. Thanks so much for asking. What is in glass to make it purple? One of the main components to make purple glass is manganese. So manganese will create purple glass. Right, Jeff said to get the opaque, maybe calcium chloride and manganese. But lots of different chemistries. We are very spoiled in this day and age that most of us, we know the basics of mixing color and maybe have had an experience on melting color, but most glass workers, they can just order it from the manufacturer. So we don't end up doing a lot of the chemistry side of this material. We do need to pay attention to the layering effects, though, because as we go to layer glasses on top of each other, they will never mix like a paint, but they will mix optically and they can mix chemically. So if we go to layer one on top of another, we got a transparent over an opaque. We can get the illusion of a third color with that laying over the top. But if we have a color that's maybe got a silver and some other different types of metals that don't want to play nicely, then you'll end up with brown edges around that glass. So usually yellows and really pale blues can end up having that brown edge around it. And that's just the chemistry of those coming together. All right, so we really are focusing a lot of time right here on the yolk, and this is smart. George is being really smart about this approach here because he's not picking it up and bringing it to the bench and then adding the wrap and then picking it up and putting it back on the yolk. They could just hang out right there and avoid all of that heavy lifting. So really what we're doing is just adding lots of these layers, lots of these bits of glass over the surface, layering up all those different purples and oranges and celadons and things to create this kind of basket weave effect on the surface of this glass. And so this is another example of the ergonomics of glassworking. And that's really important. If you're going to be blowing glass for a career, it's already a sort of a rough activity on the body. You're holding a lot of weight on the wrong, one side of your body. You're doing a lot of twisting, a lot of heavy lifting. You never can stop turning. So you're constantly using those wrists, those shoulders, the elbows. And so the more things you can do to make it an ergonomic activity, the better off you're going to be. Laura says, tell them this is the part that takes the longest. Yes, it can take a while. Sometimes the color patterning can be the longest process in the entire making of a piece. I'm sure once we actually finish all the color application, the actual forming of this vessel will be a fairly quick endeavor. But that's what's so beautiful about this material is its flexibility as a design material. So she can spend hours if she wanted to layering up lots of different colors, maybe making other little components to add to it, and kind of stacking and layering all these. Now, she's making it quicker because she's invited a lot of friends along. And that's really what makes glass blowing, again, I think, the most fun, is bringing your friends along to help you out. But if you're paying by the hour, or if you're paying your own gas bill or your own electric bill, things like that, you want to be as quick and efficient as possible. So when you're working with a piece like this that has lots of pieces, lots of components, lots of bits that need to be brought, bringing a couple extra people into that activity can really help out making it a little quicker. Plus, poor George is standing in front of that 2,000-degree furnace right now, and so the shorter amount of time he has to stand there, the better off he's going to be. So, any other questions that anyone has so far? Has everyone checked out the Tiffany exhibit that's going on right now? We've got a beautiful exhibit. It's only here for the summer, so if you did not get a chance to see that yet in your visit today, or if you come back tomorrow, you know your tags are good for 2 days, we've got that Tiffany Mosaics exhibit going on. And this is sort of reminding me a little bit of how she's working with the surface of all of this beautiful color. Because if you have a chance to go see, a lot of people are more familiar with Tiffany's blown work and the vessels and the decorative elements, but this, the mosaics are sort of made of little teeny pieces of glass, and all of the glass was handmade. And so if you're looking at an application like this, where you're wrapping all of these colors and you're layering them on top of each other, if you're going to be making a visual on a cloak and you want to have the fold of the fabric, you can end up squishing those colors around to be a particular line quality. So building up these textures, if we were to make this and make it into a big cylinder, cut it open and flatten it out, we'd have a gorgeous piece of glass with all of these layers of color. And that's really how a lot of Tiffany's work was made as well. So I love all of this whipping. Wow, look at this. It's like little lassos. Yeah. Very nice. So all this texture, they're slowly getting it to melt in, but it's always going to be a little bit of texture on the surface. But if you didn't get a chance, definitely go check out that Tiffany exhibit. If you run really quick, you might even have time to see it and come back before the end of this piece. But it's definitely worth checking out. It's a limited time offer around here to check that exhibit out. My other favorite moment of glassworking is when you come out of that furnace, whether it's out of the melting furnace or whether it's out of the reheating furnace, and you get that beautiful bright glow. I think we're going to get a close-up there. And you can see where the heat is on this. You can see how the top edges of every one of those wraps is starting to cool off. It's starting to darken. It's starting to turn closer to the color it will be. But underneath that, that's where all the heat is being held in that blob of glass. And so that glow is still coming out of it and capturing all of that heat in a visual way. We can use that visual cue to help us when we're making an object. If we were to blow out a bubble and it was all opaque and we couldn't see through it, how would we know where the thickness was? Well, that's one of the ways that we can tell. If it gets hot really quickly, starts to glow very quickly, and then loses that glow very quickly, that's going to indicate that it's a fairly thin area of the object. If it takes a little longer to get hot, and once it starts glowing, it remains glowing for longer periods of time, that's going to tell us it's a thick area of that glass. So we can use these sorts of things. We train ourselves to recognize these qualities of the material to allow us to form glass into whatever we want to. As you can see from here on just the short display that we have down here on the floor, we've got lots of examples of simple pieces that have been made in a fairly quick way. But as you walk around our museum, you'll see what a diverse material this glass is. It's been used in a lot of manufacturing aspects, but bringing it out of the manufacturer's hands, out of the factory, and into the hands of the artist is really where contemporary glass is today. We've got Laura here working on her beautiful piece, bringing her vision to life with the assistance of a few other artists here in the hot shop, bringing this type of furnace. This is a pretty small furnace compared to what you would find in a factory, even though 1,000 pounds seems like a lot of glass, and it sort of is even for a small scale studio. It is still a very minute amount of material to work with compared to what you would find in a factory. Oh, there's some beautiful celadon color we're going to be adding to the outside. So this is where we're going to be using some frit. And you're using all 3 colors? Of course. Never enough color. All right, she's laying out some celadon and some jade to complement all the purple and orange on the surface of her vessel. So these are little pieces of frit. It's the exact same material. They've been wrapping around, they've been sifting onto the surface, all this colored glass. But we can get it in anywhere from that powder to these more pea gravel sizes. And I really love the use of these big chunks like this because they're going to end up being big polka dots on the outside. And if they squitch in fast enough, they'll not just be round blobs, they'll have a little bit of angular shape to each one of those little polka dots because of the size and the texture that we find in this glass. I'm sure most of you have seen broken glass before, right? Broken a few things around the house. So it always breaks in very unusual ways, very unusual shapes. That's because of the molecular structure of this material. It's a non-crystalline structure. It's not ordered, the molecules are not in nice little ordered patterns. Instead, they are randomly patterned in this conchoidal cleavage sort of way. So if we break the glass, it's never going to break like little squares. It's never going to break like little circles. It's always going to break in very unusual ways along the path of least resistance in that piece. Oh, there we got a little bit of a fish belly. We're going to stretch that back out, reattach it to the pipe, and remelt it. There, good save, good save. Fantastic. We got another question online. Says, will this piece be fragile or will it be fairly sturdy? I would say in general, this piece will be fairly sturdy because it is going to be fairly thick. If she were to blow it out really thin, we would lose all of these beautiful colors. They would sort of wash out and it would not be very smooth on its surface. So in that aspect, for glass can be a very fragile material. But it is stronger than most people think. And the shape that we're going for, which will be kind of a basket form, it will be fairly solid, fairly thick, and so it'll be a fairly sturdy piece of final object. Now, as I mentioned earlier, though, what we're doing here in the hot shop is really just the beginning of a much larger, more complicated piece. The blown component of this, the basket form, the beautiful glass vessel, is going to be the foundation for the addition of a lot of other components to the top of this piece. This beautiful basket series it has usually some sort of arch or like handle at the top and lots of other little things tied to it. So she'll spend months and months working on the final piece. And all those little components can be fairly fragile in the way that they're constructed. But this part will be fairly solid. we go, our picking up of the frit. Hot things stick to hot things. Those little pieces of frit are fairly cold, so the hot glass itself needs to be extra hot. Just a little bit of time warms those little chips up and gets them to stick to the surface. Very nicely done, George. So I think that's going to be all that's added to the surface. She's just sweeping the excess aside so we can get back to having a fresh table. You can see this metal table. This is what we call a Marver table. And it can be used to shape our glass, and it can also be used to cool our glass. A big slab of steel, any kind of metal that you touch to the material itself is going to, of course, rob heat away from it. So it's a great tool to help shape and to cool this glass. Normally, this is a little bit rustier, but looks like somebody cleaned it recently, so it's nice and shiny, which is always nice. But it's important to keep that surface fairly smooth, because glass is very malleable. Any kind of touch that you add to it, any texture onto the tool that you touch it with, will impart a texture to that material. Now, that texture could possibly stay depending on the temperature of the material. Glass tends to have a bit of a memory, and as you work with it, wherever you touch it and cool it, as long as if you don't get it too hot again, it will continue to remember where it was touched and remain that much cooler. And so you can use that to your advantage while you're blowing glass. If you're marvering the tip of that bubble, like Jeff's doing right now, that means that it's getting a little bit colder. And so when you go to blow that piece up or do other kind of shaping, it will remain just that much colder on the end. Now, part of the thing that we're doing, though, is, of course, making it hot. We do a lot of getting it hot, getting it cold, getting it hot, getting it cold. And so, as you're working with this material, it's just controlling where that heat is and where it's a little colder to get the final shape. Oh, this is beautiful. Now, I told you earlier that we normally don't wear gloves in the hot shop due to the dexterity of the piece and the safety of being able to hold the pipe. But Jeff has put on more of like a golf glove right now. It's really thin, but this will help, and it's really hot, but it will help with a little bit of the grip. Because a big pipe like this, it can get kind of slippery if you're not careful. So by putting on that little bit of a golf glove, that's going to help him a little bit of heat, but a lot with the grip of that material. So we've pulled out our biggest block here. And again, those blocks are made of fruit woods like cherry. They are soaked in water to create a nice little steam layer. It's important not to have too much water. You don't want boiling water inside there. It would start to boil out onto whoever's holding it. Yes. I don't know. I'll look at the number. What number are we working with here? It's unmarked. It's big. It's a big block. That's the number, yes. Yeah, they do typically have numbers. They start out in low numbers and get up to about a 20, 22. I guess depending on the studio, it might go even bigger, but they might not have the stamps to be able to stamp that high. They can build it up higher and higher. But if you can't get it into a block, you can always use the paper and other things to help shape as well. They both work on the same principles, being a wood product that is burnt to create a carbon layer that has water to create steam. And the steam is really what is doing the shaping and keeping that material from sticking to the glass. If we did get a bit of wood product burnt onto the surface of that glass, there's always going to be a haze on that surface. You can get most of it to sort of burn away and not be as evident, but when you're working with color, a lot of times color is very sticky. And you can feel a difference between what that sticky of the surface of a color would be and what the sticky of the surface of a clear would be. So some colors just want to grab hold of things, and this purple, it happens to be one of those colors that wants to hold on to all the little stuff. So once again, the ergonomics, bringing the tools closer to Jeff to allow him to do this shaping. Now that we've got all of the colors that we want, we really just want to try to get all of the texture smoothed out and then start to inflate. You can see Laura's getting the exact position there, making sure she can see the profile of this. Laura's been working with glass for many, many years and has a wonderful breadth of experience with this material and can recognize, even if she's not touching the glass, she can recognize with the hands of that gaffer where this piece is moving forward, how the shape will end up with the right setup. And really, that's what glassworking is. If you just go in and let the glass make decisions, I say glass always makes really bad decisions. You really need to dictate what it's going to be by setting up certain conditions and kind of working from point A to point Z to get to the final effect that you want. Now, it's not to say you don't make happy accidents once in a while and you learn something and you can apply that to future things, and you constantly have to adjust to what is happening. Maybe the furnace is a little colder, maybe the bubble stretches a little bit too far one way in one moment, and then you need to counteract that in your next move. So that's why we say it takes so long to learn to work with this material, is to harness its natural tendencies and also learn to work with those tendencies by adjusting how you work as you go along. So it takes about 5 to 7 minimum years to get a good understanding of it, and I consider it to be a lifelong endeavor to really work with this material. I'm sure even after so many years of working, Laura is still making discoveries every day that she comes into the hot shop and working with this material. It's also, I find, really fun to work with different people because everyone approaches the material a little bit different. There's some general rules that really you can't avoid, but all the stylistic things that go into working with this material, how people translate all of this process in their brain and what they think needs to be done to get to the same end result, I always find it very interesting to see how people work. It's always funny, actually, to kind of watch demos, and you watch beginners that are coming in and watching demos, and they're trying to mimic everything that the particular gaffer is doing. They're learning through that visual experience. But if you see some famous gaffer kind of make a move and then scratch their nose and then make a move, and then you'll see the beginners start to make a move, scratch their nose, make a move. And you're like, well, why did you scratch your nose in between there? Like, well, that's what they did. I figured that was part of the process. So there's always these things that you need to pick up and really get a better understanding of why they're doing the things that they're doing, not just mimicking the movements of that gaffer and what they're trying to create. Yeah. So if you are a beginning glass student out there, I suggest always asking why. If you don't quite understand why someone's doing something, just ask them. Most glass workers are very open to sharing what their knowledge, getting people involved, but it's really getting a better understanding of that material that'll help you make whatever you want out of glass. So look at all this teamwork. We've got Aaron blowing in the end of the pipe here, inflating as Laura is down here with that wood paper, helping shape. Jeff is cutting in a jack line here as George helps turn the pipe. We've really got a lot of action here, and that's going to make that whole process a little easier working together. But that jack line, that little constriction that they put right by the end of the pipe, where the pipe ends and the piece starts, we need to break this piece away from that pipe later on in the process when we're ready to remove it from that pipe. So we need to get glass to break. And as we've mentioned a few times, glass breaks very unusual in its shape. So we need to make weaknesses. Wherever the glass is weak, that is where it will break the easiest. So by cutting in these little constriction lines, what we call a jack line, and the reason we call that a jack line is because we have tools called jacks. And so these metal blades will squeeze in. They're sharp, but more like butter knife sharp, not like knife sharp. But they're going to end up just putting a little constriction, a little weakness in there to create that space to break. All right, so we're getting into some real good shaping here. Starting to inflate this bubble just a little bit more. Using a little gravity. Once again, harnessing the natural tendencies of this material. In general, if you try to manhandle something, you squeeze it and force it into shape, you're not going to have nearly as nice of a shape as if you were to use those natural tendencies. Allow it to inflate, allow it gravity to pull it and lengthen the piece. And so really working with that material rather than against it. So for those of you who are just joining us here online or here in our Corning Museum of Glass studio here, we've got Laura Donefer as our visiting artist. Woo! Yes, give her a big round of applause. She has many fans around here because she is a very beloved glassworker here. She's been around glassworking for many years and has taught many classes. I think it's been at least 18 years ago that I met Laura up in Canada. She's from Canada. She's a wonderful artist that makes a lot of glass work and then also a lot of mixed media and found object work. And so check her out online, Laura Donefer, and see some of these images. This is one of her basket series that we're making right now, and we're really working on just the glass component of that basket series. It's going to be a vessel shape, and then the handle and all the decorative things. Usually the top parts of these are even bigger than the vessel themselves. And so all of that work that goes into the top section, she'll take this vessel back to Canada with her in her private studio and assemble all the little components, make all the little torchwork bits. She has a couple different things that she'll use to create those top sections. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing what this one comes down. It'll be months and months and months of work that she'll come back with and have this final piece. But definitely check her out online. I know we have or have had a piece of hers in our collection. So you could also find her on the website, corningmuseumofglass.org, cmog.org. You can, we've got most of our collection digitized, and you can do a lot of research between the museum collection and, of course, our Rakow Library. Also a wonderful resource to be able to do more exploration about glass and fine artists like Laura. All right, we're wondering how heavy it is now. They were guessing around 20 pounds earlier when we did all the glass. Then we probably added another 5 to 10, well, maybe 5 or 6 pounds of color on top of that. And now we've also blown it up really big. And I know that doesn't change the weight, but it changes the perceived weight because now it is further away from center, so it will feel just a little bit heavier the taller it gets. But yeah, it's probably somewhere between 25 pounds, around 25 pounds would be my guess. Yeah. But on the end of a 4-foot pole, it's always going to look bigger. Making the paper talk here. So it looks like we're getting ready to transfer this piece. Once we finish the bottom half of a vessel, we tend to trade it over onto another solid rod so that we can finish up the top half. This basket series will have a very simple vessel shape, but then the top section needs to have holes in it to be able to tie all of this top section to. So we need to remove it from that original blowpipe. So Jeff has started to gather up a little bit of clear glass on the end of an iron. Now, normally it would be just a solid iron, but because of the size of this piece, the weight of this piece, we don't have a solid pipe that's going to be as comfortable as using another blowpipe that matches. So we're just going to be making that punty on a blowpipe. Now that it's starting to really get blown out, you can see all those colors as they overlapped. Now, one thing I will tell you is that the colors that you see are not very close to the colors that it will be, because when glass is hot, it looks much different than when it's cold. Now, the purples, they're probably fairly close, the purples that we add. But the oranges, the other greens, those kind of additions, those are going to look much different. So the vibrancy of this piece will be knocked up a couple notches once it cools down to room temperature. This will probably sit in the oven for a couple days to allow it to cool down really slowly. But if you're back here, if you're local, you come back in a couple days, you'll probably end up having this out. Maybe even post an image online as a follow-up. But again, definitely check out her website and keep an eye on that over the next couple months, and she might have this one or similar ones there for you to see. You can see all that beautiful texture. Oh, what a great shot. We've got such good videographers here. Great shot of that texture that you see on the very surface. Again, the surface has been smoothed out, but because each one of those colors reacts to heat just a little bit differently, it's going to end up leaving just ever so slightly textural quality to the surface of that glass. Is just using a graphite paddle to help flatten up the bottom half, making sure it's going to sit pretty on the table, especially with such an elaborate top section that will be added to this. They've left extra thickness on the bottom for the weight, and also a nice stable base to make sure that it's can withstand all of the additions that will be added. You might have noticed she closed one of these vents. So this is a state-of-the-art glass studio. We even have air conditioning coming out of the floor to keep us a little cooler. But we don't want to have cold air blowing onto a piece that's getting slightly colder. Because as the glass starts to cool, it starts to get into this very critical temperature that if it goes too quickly down below that temperature, it could cause the glass to crack. So a couple degrees isn't going to make a huge difference to the glass, but it can end up having a breeze change the sense of timing that you need to have a successful piece. All of us have had lots of experience, and we have broken a lot of things, and we've melted a lot of things, and eventually you sort of figure out the sense of timing that's necessary to succeed with whatever particular object that you want. Probably the most critical of that sense of timing that you need is in this transfer that we're about to do. They need to make sure that the piece is warm enough to not crack, but cold enough to actually crack at the top edge. They need to make sure that the punty that Jeff is working on is hot enough to stick to the bottom gently, but if it's too hot, they won't be able to control it. then they might have to wait for the punny to cool down, which would make the top a little too cold. If it's too cold in general, then the whole thing can be too cold and separate early. The base color, another question online. I love this. This is great. They're getting a lot of online participation. The base color of this piece is purple. It's an opaque purple, sort of like I think of it as like a cartoon kind of purple. It's a beautiful, dark, opaque purple. So here's Jeff, he's got that punny. This is usually just a little bit of glass on the end of a solid iron. Once again, we are using a blowpipe just so that we have a match on the diameter of that pipe. When you're trading things from one end to the other, or one pipe to the other, you want to have a fairly smooth transition that feels balanced. And so even though we're not going to be blowing through this pipe, it's going to be used as the punny just to get that nice connection. So they're putting in a bit of a jack line on the end of that punny. That little nub of glass that's now attached to the bottom, we will separate that not at that connection to the piece, but at that little jack line that they added. That way we can cold work away that excess glass and make sure that we don't take away any of that beautiful color or any of the layer, the bottom of our vessel. So what we call a sculpture punny is just a little bit easier of a piece. You can also add it hotter. That way it's a little more secure. And it's when you're working with beautiful pieces like this with famous artists like Laura Donefer, you want a little insurance and a little assurance that it will come off the iron properly. So once it's got the right temperature and it's perfect, they're going to add a little bit of water to that weakness that we created earlier, that jack line at the top of the bubble. Water, of course, creates thermal shock, cracking that glass along that top in a controlled crack to get it to separate. Light little tap. That's all it took. The crowd goes wild. Beautiful job. I think that's one of the most stressful parts of the whole process for most people, especially the person holding the punty, because you have to make sure you brought the right shape, the right temperature, and you've got to catch the piece and get it back over to the hole and make sure it survives. So it's a lot of pressure on that person who's doing it. But of course, Jeff did a beautiful job as he's been working with glass for many, many years, probably about 25 years right now, I'm thinking, is where Jeff's at. So he's got a lot of wonderful experience, and he's making this all look so easy. But now we've got to trade it around to the other end. It's a little shift of all the equipment, all the tools, getting everything we need out. The opening of this piece, the end of that piece, it's broken at the top. Broken on purpose and broken cleanly along that top. But that means that the edge is very sharp. Everything is a little bit ragged because glass never breaks perfect. So it's a little bit ragged, a little bit sharp. So when we go back in to reheat, the glass, as it heats, it starts to round up. Glass doesn't really flow like water. It really wants to ball up on itself for the most part. So what they're looking for is that little edge to lose its sharpness, start to soften, start to get a little glow to it. Then we know we can start to further shape the top edge. Now Laura's got a very funny looking tool. This is called a Soffietta Tool. And when she goes to use this, watch really carefully. It'll take a little while before they're ready for it, but this is basically a replacement blowpipe. We've got a cone and we've got a tube. This is a bent version. This is the I do it myself version. If you're using a straight one, that's a someone else is going to blow for me version. Usually on large pieces, very tall pieces, something you might not be able to reach around. But this is going to seal up the top of that bubble, blow really hard, and inflation happens because you created a seal. So it's a great way to reinflate the shoulders of the piece, the top section of the piece, without trying to wrench it open with the tools. So now you can see that edge is nice and soft. You can also see on the very opening, while it's still thick, can you see that very thin layer of glow on the inside? That's that original layer of purple that we added. The very beginning of this entire process, we did what we call an overlay, a big blob of purple glass over the bubble. And so the base layer is that very thin layer. You see a lot of pieces down here on the floor. They may look like solid color, but if you were to break them open, you'd see that the color layer is really just a thin layer sandwiched between lots of clear. Because the color is usually fairly expensive and the color is very dense. So if we can use a small amount of that expensive part and use lots of clear glass, we keep the economics of this process a little bit better. Now you'll also traditionally see a gaffer sitting at the bench, leaning over, working on opening up a particular form. But on a piece this big, that's going to be tricky. So she's going to work on the outside. Then you're free to dance and move around and have a little more flexibility on this stuff too. So she's got those tools, those jacks in her hands. These are those metal blades. She's got a nice big pair because we're going to be working on this big piece here. And she's also protected herself quite a bit. Now, SpongeBob is probably a cotton shirt. That's a first layer of protection, working all cotton clothing. But when you're working with those sleeves, those are Kevlar sleeves that she's wearing, and those are going to be heat resistant. She also has a pair of gloves on. That's going to help protect her as well. And then we've got Erin using wooden paddles to shield her hands, to further protect her from that radiant heat coming off of this nice hot vessel. So all of those together means that Laura can really concentrate on the shape and not think so much about how hot everything is as she's working. Because I tell you, if you're used to cooking and you're reaching into an oven, that's probably topping out at around 400, maybe 450 degrees. This is looking closer around 2,000 degrees, between maybe 15 and 2,000 on that shaping. So, yeah, it can be a very distracting temperature. Oh, look at that. There's a beautiful shot of that application, all of those different layers added together. Very nice. Are we flattening this a bit? Flattening it? Okay. So as part of this basket series, there needs to be two holes added. This will be where the handle will be built on the outside. So she's going to be taking some tweezers here and just pulling slightly from both sides, and that's going to create the slightly flattened area of this vessel. And then she'll be able to drill holes into the side of our vessel. And so by doing this, the first part, pulling these little points on the two sides, it slightly flattens the vessel because, of course, gravity's pulling on the side of that vessel as it's being shaped, and then also gives her a good spot to hit that mark. Looks like maybe they were a little bit waxy, so she's going to clean those tools and warm them up. Now, beeswax, you might be wondering, well, why is the tool waxy? If you notice on the bench, there's a little cake of beeswax. The jacks that we use, those are generally one of the only tools that gets wax added to the surface of those blades. They are one of the only tools that's squeezing on the glass as it's being rotated, as it's moving. So if you're squeezing on something and trying to rotate at the same time, you're trying to stop it. So if you put a little bit of beeswax on them, they ride over the surface just a little bit easier and adds that little bit of lubrication. But beeswax has a tendency to get everywhere, and so every once in a while those tweezers or other tools will be contaminated with it, so we can just use a little bit of hot glass to help clean them up. And now that they're clean and a little warm, they're actually sticking to the glass slightly. Warm things stick to warm things. If you have cold tools, they don't stick. If you have hot tools, like the blowpipes, then you can get glass to stick to it. If you go into the furnace with a cold pipe, you will never gather glass on the end of that pipe. It's only a hot pipe that allows you to gather glass. All right, here comes the hole drilling. So we've got fire, we've got flame, we've got hot tungsten rod. That's what we're gonna do. We got a tungsten rod put into the end of this drill. We're gonna get the end of that tungsten rod really hot. It is sharpened slightly, so it will move through it a little bit easier, but we're going to drill a hole in the side of this vessel just by using that hot tungsten. Now, one of the things about this, it won't stick to the glass. It's also very rigid. A lot of metal will get soft when it gets hot, but the tungsten, it's used as a welding tool. It will not soften and bend while she's working on this. And so if the glass is a little bit colder, it's not going to move, and so we won't misshape our piece, and they can work together to create this little hole. Now, as we're focusing a lot of energy on the drilling of these holes, we need to make sure that we're not neglecting the rest of the piece. That was beautifully done, Laura. Very nicely done. Yes. So we don't want to neglect the rest of the piece, so you saw George using that hand torch to spot heat the bottom of our piece. We've got a big wide open piece. Every time we go back into that hole, the lip of that piece goes in first, it comes out last. That means the opening, the thinner edge is always going to be hotter. We need to make sure that the bottom of the piece doesn't get too cold and start to crack, or the punty get too cold and start to separate too early. So we can use the torch, and the torch is a really wonderful tool to be able to spot heat the punty by itself or the bottom of the piece by itself, and maintain all of those temperatures necessary for a successful piece. One of the other introductions that we got 3 different torches up here. Right now she's just using a MAP gas torch. It's a pretty hot flame, but it's going to allow her to drill lots of holes. Again, all of these little holes are to be able to tie the extra components and the decorative elements that will be added to this piece once it cools down, once she takes it back to Canada and she sits in her studio and adds and ties and builds all these beautiful additions to it. We also have, of course, the bigger fluffy torch, and that's still hot, but it's considered a little bit colder of a flame. It's a general flame. It's going to really allow us to soak heat into the entire bottom section of this piece. And then there's one more that's hanging there, and that's a hot torch. And a hot torch is not just the gas, it also has oxygen. So it creates a very, very hot flame. Most often you will see those types of torches in flame working, which is what she'll be doing for all the components that will be added to this, is flame working on the flame using rods of glass, heating those up in that flame, just the ends of those rods, to create shapes and objects out of that. But that really hot torch has become more and more common in the hot glass studio and used for a lot of sculptural work, a lot of spot heating and manipulation of the surface of glass. And the addition of that hot torch has really revolutionized the approach of sculpture within the glass community. So you'll probably see those around in a lot of studios nowadays working with them. There you can see, hole after hole, using that tungsten rod. It doesn't end up sticking, even though it's glowing red. Most other metals, if it's glowing red and you try to get glass to it, it would end up sticking to the glass, but this one does not. Now, I'm sure to a certain extent, Laura would just love to stand there and just get all those holes drilled, go all the way around, get everything finished, and just have it all done. But if she were to stand there for too long, then the punty would start to get cold, and as she's pushing, that torque could break it off. So they're being very conscientious about going back for reheats and making sure that everything's staying warm. And you might say, well, Helen, how do they know? How do they know how long they can get away with it before they go back in to get more glass or to reheat that glass? The only way they know is because they know, because they've done it enough times. They've got a lot of experience. It's all a guessing game, and sometimes you win the battle, sometimes you lose the battle, but in general, you have a good understanding of that guessing game, and you can end up having the piece survive. So since these holes are going to be used for tying all this stuff, she needs to make sure that they are the right size, and then nothing's going to be too sharp. So they're really spending a little extra time making sure everything is perfect. Another most important thing of glass blowing is hydration. So a little bit of water is always helpful. Any other questions that anyone might have? What's that? How thin it is on the lip? I would say not quite half an inch. Yeah. Yeah, the bottom is a little thicker to create that weight, and then the top edge is maybe a little under half an inch. But I think we're coming in on the final touches of this piece. George is getting dressed in the silver suit.
If I don't heat up all the holes I've drilled, they will crack afterwards. So I have to put the temperature back in the holes.
All right, so Laura just gave us a little insider tip here. She said all those holes that she drilled, she's learned through, again, experience, that if you don't go back in and reheat each one of those holes, smooth out all of the little cracks and things that can form from that drilling process, they will end up cracking in that final form. So she's going right now and going back in and making sure that each one of those little drilled holes is nice and smooth and warmed up a little bit to assure the survival of that piece. With the time that has gone into all of the color application and the expense of using all of those colors, having such a big team with her and things, you definitely want to take those extra steps to make sure that you can have a piece survive in that process. And I'm sure that was a few lessons learned in the early stages. She's been working with this basket series for about 33 years, she says, so she's had lots of experience working with this. I've seen a couple different forms of these. They're beautiful pieces, and the tops, as much as I love the glass, it's the extra stuff on the top that really brings these pieces to life as well. So again, check her out online. You'll find lots of wonderful examples of this series over the past 30 years being made and displayed all over the world. And you can see what a variety and how much labor is involved in the additions that are added to the top and all the tying on the top of our vessels. Those of you who are here towards the front, you might also get to see what a difference that inside, that smooth purple coloration that we started with, that opaque purple, and then all of the wraps that were added on the outside. We've got 3 or 4 different color of purple wraps, and orange, a tangerine, I believe she said. We've got celadon added on there, a little bit of red, and then all those polka dots of the jade green and the celadon on the surface. Many of these colors are very different right now than what they will be when they cool down, but you'll have to take my word for it, how much vibrancy these will have once this piece has come down to room temperature. Now, any glass that we want to save, and this one, of course, we do want to save and make sure it cools down properly, we need to let it cool down in one of our annealing ovens. You see quite a few of these boxes around the studio. Those are going to hold the glass at around 920 to 950 degrees, and when it's ready, they'll start bringing it down so many degrees per hour down to room temperature. So the amount of time it takes to bring this down to room temperature is based on the thickness, it's based on the shape, it's based on the color. It's mostly the thickness, but if you can take months and months to cool a piece if it's solid, if it's very large. So this one will take a couple days in our annealing oven, cooling down really slowly, and then we'll pull it out at room temperature and send it off with Laura back to Canada to do all the fantastic additions that she's going to add. So George has the silver suit. This is a heat-resistant spaceman type suit. And we're trying to shove some gloves on him here. These are Kevlar gloves. These are heat protective gloves as well. These will allow George to actually touch this hot piece and put it away into our annealing oven. And then, of course, a face shield to protect those eyebrows as he goes into that 900 and above oven. Especially when you have a nice big piece like this, you want to assure that you are not feeling the heat and you can calmly set it into the oven in its proper place. Before it goes away, though, we're going to take a few heats. We need to balance out the temperatures. We've done a lot of work at the top. We're going to make sure that everything's the same temperature as we go to load it away. We don't want to leave it too hot. If it's too hot, it'll start to slump. We have kiln shelf inside of there, but there's also fiber frax, which is a really soft, kind of fluffy material to set it on, so there's no flat spots. Putting a little bit of water on that connection. It's meant to be a very temporary connection. Remember, we created a jack line in that punty, so it will separate at that line and that line only. Light little tap. That's all it took, folks. Beautiful piece, Laura Donefer. Fantastic, wonderful piece. Really look forward to seeing that come out of the oven in a couple days. I think she's happy with it, folks. Fantastic.